It's Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Oh boy, do we have one for you this week. This one is a bit of a controversial movie. I'm going to talk about 2003's House of a Thousand Corpses, written and directed by Rob Zombie. There's no better place to start than with Zombie himself. While his film career is certainly debated in the horror world, there's no doubt that this hard-rockin' frontman is something of a god in the East Coast noise metal genre. He helped form the band that would eventually call themselves White Zombie after the 1932 Bela Lugosi film of the same name. And they did some albums with some success, but it was 1995's Astro Creep 2000 that would launch them into massive successes thanks to the fantastic single More Human Than Human. This would also get them into 3 soundtracks the following year for Escape from LA, The Crow City of Angels, and Beavis and Butthead Do America. Astro Creep would also serve as the end of the line for White Zombie. Rob Zombie then went solo with 1998's Hellbilly Deluxe and 2 more fairly sizable hit singles, Dragula and Living Dead Girl. In 2001, he had yet another successful solo release, The Sinister Urge. His stage shows are often considered some of the very best of the hard rock and heavy metal scene. He's even joined on stage by the robot creature from the 30s Lugosi serial The Phantom Creeps. Obviously, Zombie is a showman, so it only makes sense that he had at least a little bit of an eye toward making movies. Clearly, he was also a monster kid growing up. That simply cannot be argued with his stage show, his rock persona, and the use of names and imagery from classic horror films of the 30s. And that brought him to taking a shot at making his first horror film, and the one that we're talking about this week, House of a Thousand Corpses. While that's an extremely quick rundown of Zombie the Rockstar, he's had a long, over 35-year career in music. I can't possibly cover everything. However, I think the background for how this movie went from concept to filming is even quicker. According to Zombie himself, he came up with this title as he was designing a haunted house attraction for Universal. He had been involved in Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights attraction back in 1999 and was coming up with something new. As he talked to some chiefs at Universal, he kind of just came up with this plot on the spot and certainly came up with just the title. They reacted pretty positively, and he went home, wrote up a 12-page treatment, and again, according to Zombie, he was shooting the movie only a couple of months later. The movie would be made in the year 2000, but was ultimately shelved. Zombie says he was very, very frank with Universal. He did not want to make a mainstream horror movie. It's kind of interesting because later on, when he makes the Halloween remakes, they are the most bizarre mainstream horror movies ever released by a studio, which I believe Universal did release those too. But he wanted to do something more drive-in-like or Grindhouse in nature. He wanted it to be visceral and an uncomfortable watch. He wanted it to feel kind of realistic in terms of terror. Think the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I do think is a heavy influence on this movie. When Universal became scared of a likely NC-17 rating, they pulled it from possible release. But Zombie didn't want to scrap the movie totally like so many people around him was suggesting. So he went to MGM, who did want to release the film in 2002, but they changed their mind also after Zombie, probably playing up the appreciation for them being kind of ballsy with this type of violent horror film, said that they had no morals for releasing the film as it was. But finally, it landed with Lionsgate, who probably doesn't have any morals themselves, considering the wide range of movies they release. But the film was trimmed to achieve that R rating, and the movie did see release finally in April of 2003. While the film would go on to gross just under $17 million worldwide, the opening weekend's gross of $3.5 million made pretty much all of the investment from Lionsgate back. And considering how cheap it was that they got this movie, even though it's rumored that the movie totally cost about $15 million, which means that the movie wasn't really a box office success, it was certainly a success for Lionsgate because they only spent the $3.5 million to acquire the rights to it. So seeing that they had something that appealed at least to a very specific group of horror fans, and it was made by a very popular musician who also appealed to those horror fans, and it stood to become a cult classic in years to come. So that caused Lionsgate to request a sequel immediately, and Zombie went to work right away on the superior The Devil's Rejects. But we're not here to talk about that sequel. We're here to talk about House of a Thousand Corpses. The movie begins in 1977, and in the opening scene, we see Captain Spaulding's Museum of Monsters and Murderers. There, Captain Spaulding, a foul-mouthed clown, played by Sid Haig, is talking to Michael J. Pollard, who's playing a character named Stucky. Now, Spaulding both runs this roadside attraction and also sells fried chicken. But suddenly, two masked men bust in to rob the place, and Stucky recognizes one of the robbers from working at a local hardware store, I think he says, which then distracts them long enough for a friend of Spaulding's to come in and knock one out while Spaulding kills the other with the gun under the counter. He then ends up killing the other robber and basically cleans up the mess. Later, a car of four, I think they're 20-somethings. I think sometimes they're described as late teens. But Jerry, played by Chris Hardwick, Bill, played by Rainn Wilson, Mary, played by Jennifer Jostin, and Denise, played by Erin Daniels, need to stop for gas. They're on a cross-country road trip of sorts. Now, unfortunately for them, as it turns out, they stop at Captain Spaulding's place. Now, Jerry is instantly excited about checking out the museum full of oddities. You see, Jerry and Bill are writing a book about strange roadside attractions across the country. Now, their girlfriends aren't as interested in this stuff, but they are, they kind of do, pictures for the guys and everything. And Spaulding takes the foursome on a murder ride, as he calls it, that has a lot of history of murderers and animatronics and stuff like that. They come to the end where there's a display about the local legend of Dr. Satan. The good doctor was an intern at a mental institution, and he was also a master surgeon. He'd mess with the patients and create all sorts of monstrosities. When he was finally caught, he was sentenced to be hanged for his crimes, which he was. However, his body went missing the next day and was never found. The thought is that he survived and has been in hiding ever since, or at least that's the local legend. Now, Jerry is particularly taken by the tale of Dr. Satan. Denise calls her dad, and she does mention that they stopped by this place called Captain Spaulding's. And while she does that, we do hear about some missing teenage girls from the area. And also, Jerry asks Spaulding more about where the hanging tree was that Dr. Satan was hanged from. Spaulding seems reluctant, but eventually gives him directions and basically sends the foursome on their way. On the way, they pick up a blonde hitchhiking on the side of the road, and this girl's name is Baby, played by Rob Zombie's wife, Sherry Moon. She guides them toward where the tree is, and someone, hiding in the bushes, shoots their tire and strands the group on the side of the road. Baby says that they can basically just walk to her house from where they are, and her brother has a tow truck that can get their car and help them out. And this is where we meet Otis, played by Bill Moseley. He is one of Baby's siblings, if you will, in what's called the Firefly family. Now, he's delivering a grand speech about trying to help these captive cheerleaders that we've been hearing about on the radio. Baby and Bill, who have now arrived at the Firefly residence, says her brother has already left to get their car and invites Bill inside. Now, the outside of the place would give me some pause to want to go inside this place, because outside, nailed to the wall, are all the dolls' heads of the figures that Baby decapitated as a child. So I'd probably not want to go inside. But anyway, once everyone is eventually brought back to the house, the two couples meet Mother Firefly. She's played by Karen Black. She is just as loopy as Baby is. And they also get a little bit of a runaround about trying to get to a phone so that they can, call Denise's dad or get some additional help as far as getting a new tire, all of that. But knowing that they are going to be stuck there for at least another couple of hours, the four travelers decide to try to play it cool and not make any more waves, and ultimately stay for dinner. And they meet the rest of the Firefly family, which includes Tiny, a disfigured giant, Grandpa Hugo, and, of course, Otis. Now, Jerry asks if anyone knows more about the legend of Dr. Satan, and, of course, Otis does. And he claims to know the actual facts surrounding the legend. And he says that Jerry and the rest should probably leave while they still have the more pleasant version of the story that Captain Spaulding told them. As the clock strikes the top of the hour, Grandpa announces dinner is over and it's showtime. And Grandpa does a stand-up act that is mostly just yelling and making very off-colored jokes that Jerry just eats up. He is loving every minute of it. Then Baby comes out to lip-sync a Betty Boop song that gets the guys rather hot and bothered. But then when Baby gets a little too handsy with Bill, Mary, his girlfriend, begins yelling at her and telling her to, take her hands off him, calls her a slut, all of that stuff. And just as things begin to escalate and Baby threatens to cut her, Rufus, the guy who both shot out the tire and repaired it, comes in to tell everybody that they can leave. But as they get to the gate, Bill has to get out to open it and is attacked, and he and Jerry are badly beaten by Otis. Otis and Tiny then also capture the girls, and the next morning Rufus goes to hide their car, and back at home, Don, which is Denise's dad, calls the authorities near where Captain Spaulding's place is, which isn't too far away from home, actually. That's one of the kind of sad things about this, is that Don joins up with the search later, and I'll get to that here in just a moment, but he knows people in the area because it wasn't that far away from Denise's home. But he basically asks for someone to go from the sheriff's office to go look for Denise and the rest of the gang. But unfortunately, the travelers are now in the clutches of the Fireflies. Mary wakes up from being knocked out and asks where Bill is. Otis says that, he's been a great help to him. Otis has had this terrible case of creative block, but Bill helped him out of that. You see, he shows her what became of Bill. And basically, Otis took Bill's body, cut it in half, and where his legs once were, Otis has put the back half of a fish, turning him basically into an oddity attraction, if you will. Elsewhere, the police show up to ask Spaulding about the missing kids, and they show him a picture of Denise and ask him about where he saw her and what happened to her and so on. Spaulding does tell them that they asked about the whole Dr. Satan thing and the farm road where they set out to learn more about the local legend. So the cops go out to look, but Spaulding figures that the kids probably just got turned around and got lost. Now, the cops do find the car, but of course the kids are missing. But in the trunk is one of the missing cheerleaders with Trick or Treat cut into her flesh. Back at the Firefly house, Mary thinks she's able to escape when Tiny just kind of unties the ropes around her wrist, but she runs right into Otis, who throws her into a cage where she's attacked by the surviving cheerleaders. It's kind of a scene that's somewhat reminiscent of there's a couple of movies from the 70s, one of them being Bloodsucking Freaks, where the girls are so tortured. The first group of people that were kind of captured by the Fireflies are so tortured and everything, they've become kind of animalistic. It's kind of a similar idea to the Bloodsucking Freaks part that this is totally taken from. But Bill is also scalped by Baby when he incorrectly answers a trivia question about something he can't possibly know, which is who's her favorite movie star. So basically the kids are getting tortured at this point. Now the police arrive at the Firefly house after picking up Denise's dad, who was a retired cop. And while the sheriff is inside talking to Mother Firefly, the deputy and Denise's dad, Don, find more of the dead cheerleaders. And kind of hanging in this, I think it's an outhouse really, is a barely conscious Mary. When the deputy calls the sheriff, Mother Firefly kills the sheriff while Otis kills the deputy and Denise's father. Later that night, Otis takes Jerry, Mary, and Denise to an old well. He tells Jerry that everything about Dr. Satan is real, and they're going to meet him. As Tiny puts Jerry into a coffin, Mary breaks free and tries to escape, but Baby hunts her down and stabs her to death. Denise is also dumped into the coffin with Jerry, and they are lowered into the well. There, some of the legendary Dr. Satan's failed experimental surgery victims bust open the coffin and drag Jerry away into the cavernous caves that is beside the well. And Denise is left to walk through the caves alone, and she does find Jerry, but he's being operated on by a ghastly old man with a breathing mask on. This is Dr. Satan. He sends a grotesque, almost cyborg-like creature after her, and he pursues her to a dead end where she dodges a swing of his axe that brings down a support beam, causing the cave to basically cave in on itself. It also provides Denise a way out of the caverns, and she makes her way to the main road where Captain Spaulding picks her up and tells her that he'll get her to a doctor. After she passes out, Otis emerges from the back seat, and when Denise wakes up again, she's strapped to an operating table about to become Dr. Satan's next experiment. She screams in horror as the movie ends. Let's talk about the three things I like about House of a Thousand Corpses. First off, I want it to be well known that this movie more or less should go against everything I would absolutely hate to watch in a movie. It's mean, it's cruel. It's about 90 minutes of watching characters going through absolute hell with no happy ending to be had. It's everything I would normally avoid at almost all costs. Yet, the movie is uniquely crafted to appeal to the part of me that doesn't mind watching the grainy and grimy 70s exploitation horror films that this movie is so obviously inspired by. In some ways, it shares DNA with the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In others, it shares the traits of the movies that came in that one, or like with Last House on the Left's Wake. This is a movie that is unapologetically mean. And I'm not going to say that any of our four main characters are meant to be liked or disliked, and therefore setting up some sort of sense of cheering for them to be killed or feeling sorry when they are hurt or killed or tortured or hoping that they escape or anything like that. This movie isn't so much interested in that. Instead, it seems to want to get in the heads of the perpetrators of the violence. And I'll have more to say about that angle in just a moment, but House of a Thousand Corpses, unlike its successor, The Devil's Rejects, is actually more interested in dropping you right into a scene with these various characters. We have no reason to like or dislike the four travelers. We have no indication of what made the Firefly family what they are. We're just there. We're witnesses to the brutality of their actions. In a strange way, it almost becomes an unfeeling account of these four travelers' last days on this planet. I become both fascinated and repulsed by it, which then ultimately kind of scares me that these sorts of things could really be in this world. Oftentimes, there's not a whole lot of explanation why somebody becomes particularly brutal if they become unhinged and decide to kidnap people on the side of the road and torture them to death. We're never really granted too much insight on what makes them that way. So it becomes almost random how even if there's somebody out there who are coming up with these plans and coming up with these ideas of how to hurt people, it may seem all calculated from their perspective, but to the rest of us, it's random and it's scary. And it certainly plays to those things that exploitation films of the 70s did so well in the horror genre. Now, second, kind of the tie to that first that I had, this movie is constructed in a very weird way that will either make or break the movie for most. In some ways, I can see the music video style of editing that Rob Zombie was most accustomed to. In other ways, it almost gives me a look inside the heads of people who are not particularly thinking straight or are flat out insane. It might also be a look inside the mind of Zombie himself as he inserts things that are almost like flashes of mental cues or things you might think about when you hear a word or a phrase or see a person or what have you. Mostly, though, I watch this movie almost like I'm remembering a dream or a nightmare. Either a dream or a nightmare will have some sort of narrative, usually. Even if it's out of context or you only remember a single scene, quote unquote, of the dream, there's still a narrative of some sort. House of a Thousand Corpses has a narrative, obviously, but it also has those quick edits or uses inserts or camera angles that really to really kind of unease you or distract me, the viewer. Not everything you see in the movie makes a whole lot of sense, nor does it really try to. Once you get to the big climax where you do end up meeting Dr. Satan and there are bizarre satanic rituals taking place, you are begging to wake up from this nightmare that you're not just watching, but kind of sort of living with these characters. Thirdly, there is absolutely no way to think of either this movie or the sequel without thinking about the three main murderous mayhem makers played by Sid Haig, Bill Moseley, and Sherry Moon. They all occupy three slightly different spaces in terms of characters, while all having a frightening element to them. Moseley's Otis is very much a Charles Manson type. He thinks and talks about different things than most do. His speech pattern at least sounds learned, or at least overtly philosophical. He feels very much, I think he thinks of himself very much as somebody who's truly awake to the way the world works, if that makes sense. Though instead of trying to make it a better place, he lashes out in horrifically violent ways. He sounds and kind of looks to a certain extent a lot like a Charlie Manson. Sid Haig's Captain Spaulding is downright likable. Granted, I don't know if I want to go to a shithole pub on the wrong side of town with him and spend an entire evening with him, because I will either eventually be killed or be asked to kill someone. But I'd stop in for a bucket of his chicken and shoot the shit for up to maybe about 30 minutes. He's interesting, and he seems to be friendly enough that if he has no reason to hurt you, then he won't. In fact, he'll probably actually like you. Then you have Sherry Moon's baby. Good Lord, is she every bit of the wrong type of person to be attracted to. She's overly girly and playful. She's flirty. She'll pay you some attention. Yet she'll snap on a moment's notice and pull a knife, and if she had her way, shove it into your stomach for shits and giggles. The sequel, The Devil's Rejects, does something amazing with these characters by almost making you like them, but the foundation is here in this movie. They are compelling characters. They are horrible monsters, but they are interesting people. Every time it goes to one of these characters, you find yourself sort of hanging on what they're saying and doing. Zombie has rarely been able to achieve this kind of character building again compared to what he did with the first two films. However, I can easily defend his work in this movie for thrusting me into a nightmare scenario and giving me something to watch closely with the villain characters, because I know what he ends up doing with these characters, and the groundwork is perfectly laid out here. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, it's high time we get to the movie that made names like Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell into the people that we know and love today. Join me for 1981's creepy cabin horror, The Evil Dead. Until next week, stay spooky.